Now, the 60s. If you want to talk socially in the 1960s, I think what you're going to find rather quickly is that there's a lot of change. If you look at the United States in 1960 and you look at the United States in 1969, it's a very different place. There are a lot of things that have happened. Probably one of the biggest social movements of the 60s is the Civil Rights Movement. Now, the Civil Rights Movement had been going on since the 50s. Lots of things happened in the 50s. Rosa Parks, for example, the Montgomery bus boycott that happened after that, the Little Rock Nine, the Brown versus the Board of Education decision. All of those things had been happening already in the 1950s, and hopefully you read about all of them in your chapters in the textbook and in the PowerPoint. But the 60s continues on that course with the civil rights movement, and it gets more and more heated, more and more demanding, I guess you could say. And the main figure that you're still looking at in the 60s when it comes to civil rights is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Very famously, he was leading the movement. He was a reverend. He gave his famous I Have a Dream speech in 1963, but he did so much more than that. He led marches in Birmingham, in Selma, and if you've watched the latest movie about him, it discusses that in great length. The movement was becoming a little bit more frustrating, I think, because things were not changing as quickly as I think people like Martin Luther King would have liked to have seen. And it's an interesting time. Now, the other big figure in the 60s when it comes to civil rights is Malcolm X. And Malcolm X, if you get the chance, read his autobiography. It's not long. Have a read. He chose X for his last name because he did not want to use his last name because it was the last name of the family that had owned his ancestors, and he didn't like that. And he didn't know what the family name was before that, so he went with X. He was kind of the opposite of Martin Luther King a little bit. He was willing to go to violence if need be. He just had a different mentality completely than Martin Luther King. Although I think they were both a little frustrated and they started kind of on each end. Martin Luther King was over here going, nonviolence. Martin Luther King went, yes, or excuse me, Malcolm X went, yeah, violence is okay. And by the end of the 60s, they kind of came together there. The other big thing of the 60s to talk about is what President Johnson called the Great Society. It was President Johnson's domestic program to help people get out of poverty. That was one of his big goals, you get rid of poverty. And that involved things like low-income housing, Head Start, things like that. Things that back then were called welfare, right? And the biggest problem that he had with that was that they were fighting the Vietnam War at the exact same time. And so they ended up with spending a lot of money. And it was unsustainable because the Great Society and the war in Vietnam were both going to take a lot of money, and there wasn't enough money to do that, and he had to make some big decisions. The other thing, and I would be remiss if I did not mention it, is sort of the counterculture of the 60s. The teen culture, the baby boom generation, the people that were born directly after World War II, by the end of the 60s were teenagers, and they were experimenting with all kinds of different things. The drug culture, the quote-unquote hippie culture, right? And rock and roll. So lots of changes. Think about that. The civil rights movement, the counterculture, the Great Society, lots of things happening, and the world in 1960 was a lot different than it was in 1969, for sure. Again, look at Chapter 28 if you do have any questions, and as always, happy history.